afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday, March 19th, 2024. It is approximately 3:11 p.m., and I call this meeting of the Senate Elections Committee to order. We do actually have a quorum. All right, today we're going to start consideration of the Omnibus Elections Policy Bill. Senator Carlson, would you like to give us some opening remarks?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee. Madam Chair and members, I'm pleased to present the Elections Policy Omnibus Bill in the A5 amendment to Senate File 4729. It continues the work we started last year to protect and expand the freedom to vote in Minnesota. Some of the highlights in this area include ensuring high school students are offered the opportunity to pre-register to vote, expanding the photo IDs that can be used in combination with college student housing lists, and allowing online absentee ballot applications to be used for odd-year elections. And also we're expanding who can serve as a witness for an absentee ballot. It corrects a long-term error in how we have counted people in prison for the purposes of redistricting by changing it so that they will be counted at the address where they resided just before they were incarcerated. It adds transparency of money spent in politics by centralizing the filings for PACs and political parties who spend in local elections. It addresses challenges posed by evolving technologies such as strengthening deepfake prohibitions and expanding electioneering provisions to include digital communications. It also includes additional provisions, including those brought forward by agencies to ease election and campaign finance administration. Madam Chair, that's my comments for right now, and I'm ready to hear the your comments and the council's rundown of the bill.
Thank you, Senator Carlson. So we will now have Senate Council walk through the A5 amendment that was posted last Friday, and following that, we will hear public testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. I'll be walking through the A5 amendment. The provisions in the amendment are from bills that were already heard by the committee, so I'll go through at a high level and can answer questions after if there are any. On page 1, section 1 comes from Senate File 3875, a Senator Mitchell provision that allows census workers to access multi-unit dwellings regardless of when the activity is conducted. Page 1, section 2 comes from the same Senate file, and this is allowing for the reallocation or exclusion of incarcerated people based on their last known address immediately prior to incarceration, and this is for redistricting purposes. And I'll note that there was a modification on lines 310 to 312 for the geocoding of addresses on what is and isn't an acceptable address. Oh, apologies, that's from a different Senator Mitchell bill. That was from Senate File 3878. On page 3, section 3 is from Senate File 4039, a Senator Westland bill. This allows local governments to use voter funds to transition to a .gov domain. On page 4, sections 4 and 5 define ballot question and local candidate to include all local ballot questions and local candidates, and not just those in the Hennepin County local governments. And that's from Senator Bolden, Senate File 3499. On page 4, section 6 provides a definition of employee of a political subdivision for purposes of Chapter 10A. There's a modification in this section to style but not substance. This was from Senator Putnam's Senate File 4700. On page 5, section 7, also from Senate File 4700, it amends the definition of lobbyist to exclude people conducting certain activities and strikes references to urging others to communicate with officials. On page 7, section 8, another section from Senate File 4700 amends the definition of principal. On page 7, section 9 comes from Senate File 3457, a Senator Westland bill, requires rounding to the nearest $5,000 on principal reports. On page 8, section 10 comes from Senate File 3499 from Senator Bolden, renames the pre-primary report as a July report. On page 9, section 11 comes from Senate File 4729, Senator Carlson, amends the board's ability to impose late filing fees and increases late filing fees. Starting on page 10, sections 12 through 16 also come from Senate File 4729 from Senator Carlson. These are the changes to the electioneering communication sections where it adds digital and online communications and refers to endorsing instead of nominating in certain sections and adds references to political funds and party units. And in a couple of instances in these provisions, there were changes to references to personal devices were changed to electronic devices. On page 14, section 17, another provision from that same bill allows the board to impose late filing fees related to statements about the use of general treasury money. On page 14, section 18, from Senate File 4951 from Senator Westland, amends the process for filling school board vacancies. On page 15, section 19, from Senate File 4729, Senator Carlson, amends the definition of major political party. On page 17, sections 20 and 21, from Senator Westland's 3818, strikes references to student IDs and moves it to the following section, which allows students to in post-secondary institutions to use different types of IDs to vote. Starting on page 20, sections 22 and 23 from Senate File 3818 from Senator Westland requires voter registration applications to allow for a physical description of a location. On page 22, section 24 from Senator Westland's 3818 prohibits making the public voter information list public on the internet or on databases and other restrictions on that use. On page 24, section 25 comes from Senator Swedzinski's 3871 and has to do with high school voter registration applications. On page 25, section 26 comes from Senate File 4432 from Senator Westland and allows online absentee ballot applications for all elections except for town elections in March. On page 26, section 27 comes from the same Senate file, allows a U.S. citizen to sign the certificate on an absentee ballot signature envelope. On page 27, section 28 comes from Senate File 3818, Senator Westland, modifies provisions related to resolutions requiring write-in candidates to request their vote be counted. On page 28, section 29 comes from the same Senate file, deletes redundant language. On page 29, section 30 from the same Senate file specifies that the Secretary of State must prepare and provide example ballots for state elections. On page 29, sections 31 through 33 from the same Senate file make changes to the requirements around language minority districts, translation and interpreter requirements, and related sample ballot format requirements. On page 31, sections 34 and 35, also from Senate File 4432, Senator Westland, modify provisions related to exit polling. On page 32, section 36 from the same Senate file explains how to include absentee ballot results in precinct results on election day. On page 32, section 37 from 3818, a Senator Westland bill, provides cleanup language on election judges tallying votes. On page 32, section 38 from the same Senate file requirements related to precincts using ballot tabulators. On page 33, section 39 from the same Senate file provides clarifying language on what must be included in a summary statement if alternative ballot styles are used. On page 34, sections 40 and 41 from the same Senate file adjust the timeline for county and state canvass to happen sooner. On page 35, section 42 from the same Senate file adds a cross-reference to a new subdivision on recounts for presidential electors. On page 36, section 43 from the same Senate file amends the threshold for when the cost of a recount is paid for by the jurisdiction conducting the recount. On page 36, section 44 from the same Senate file provides a request for a recount for presidential electors. On page 38, section 45 from the same Senate file amends the threshold for when the cost of the recount is paid for by the jurisdiction. On page 38, section 46 amends provisions for discretionary ballot question recounts. Starting on page 39, sections 47 through 51 from the same Senate file are a collection of sections that amend various timelines to provide 84 days notice to the county auditor for various local elections. On page 40, that takes us to section 52, also from Senate File 3818 from Senator Westland, amends the section related to school districts combining polling places. On page 41, section 53 from the same Senate file requires precincts that use alternative ballot styles to provide paper ballots and precincts that hand count ballots. On page 41, sections 54 to 57 from the same Senate file moves up the post-election review timelines. On page 43, section 58 allows the governor's designee to deliver the certificate of the names of the presidential electors, and requires the electors to meet at the state capitol and strikes the requirement that it be in the executive chamber. On page 44, sections 59 and 60 from the same Senate file make a technical correction and a reference to federal law. On page 40, starting on page 44, section 61 to 69, in the same bill, establish a new chapter of law, chapter 209A, that provide for presidential elector recounts. Starting on page 47, sections 70 through 80 are the Senator Bolden bill, Senate File 3499. And in conjunction with the changes from section 4 and 5, these sections move the responsibility for overseeing the campaign finance reporting requirements for political committees, political funds, and party units engaged in campaign activity for local elected offices and ballot questions from the local filing officers to the campaign finance board to oversee. It makes various other changes to reporting requirements in 211A. On page 51, sections 81 and 82 come from Senator Mayquade's 3550 relating to deep fake provisions later in the bill. These are the sections related to forfeiture of nomination and disqualification from office. On page 52, section 83 come from Senator Mitchell's 3878 and require the Commissioner of Corrections to collect addresses as part of the intake process. This relates to the reallocation and exclusion for redistricting purposes from earlier in the bill. On page 52, section 84 comes from Senator Westland's 3818, and it amends the notice that's provided to a person upon release from incarceration, notifying them that their right to vote has been restored. On page 53, sections 85 and 86 come from Senator Carlson's 3555 and amend the process for filling vacancies in sheriff or county attorney. On page 54, section 87 comes from Senator Westland's 3818, and this is another change, changing the number of days of notice to 84 to the county auditor. On page 54, section 88 comes from Senator Westland's 4039 and requires every county and municipality that administers absentee voting to use a .gov domain website. On page 55, sections 89 through 93 come from Senator Mayquade's 3550, and these are the deep fakes, the provisions on the use of deep fakes to influence an election. Moving to page 57, section 94 comes from Senator Mitchell's 3878, and this is again going back to the reallocation and exclusion of population bill, and this requires the Commissioner of Corrections to collect information from currently incarcerated persons. On page 58, section 95 comes from Senator Putnam's 4700, and it requires the Campaign Finance Board to study and make recommendations to the legislature on the definition of lobbyist. On page 58, section 96 comes from Senate File 3818, Senator Westland, and provides for a transition to new voter registration applications because of the change related to the option to list a physical location. On page 58, section 97, it specifies that the newly created chapter 209 must be called election contests, presidential elections, and that's from Senator Westland's 3818. And then there's, on page 58, section 98, a repealer that comes from Senator Bolden's 3499, Senator Westland's 4432, Senator Carlson's 4729, and Senator Westland's 3818. And it repeals a variety of bills, including the definition of ballot question and definition of committee. It repeals a congressional candidate financial report provision. It repeals a provision related to specifically to the Hennepin County board vacancies, a definition of targeted to the relevant electorate, which is merged with existing language in the bill, and repeals the notice language that's provided to people upon release from incarceration, and then provides an effective date on page 59 in section 99.
Thank you very much for that walkthrough of that bill. So at this time, we are going to hear public testimony, and just to lay out the process for the remainder of our time together this week. After we hear public testimony on Thursday, we're going to actually then consider any amendments to the bill and have discussion and vote on the bill on Thursday. And Senator Carlson has already provided his opening remarks, so we will move to testifiers at this point. And our first person on the list is Nicole Freeman from the Office of the Secretary of State. As always, please state your name for the record and then proceed.
Thank you, Chair and Senator Carlson. Nicole Freeman, Office of the Secretary of State. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the A5 amendment. This amendment includes several pieces of legislation that will help improve Minnesota's election system and serve Minnesota voters. Specifically, I want to highlight a few key provisions that will improve Minnesota's election system. The amendment includes clarifying that the student voting list provided by a post-secondary institution can be used as proof of residence in conjunction with any form of ID currently permitted for Election Day registration. The amendment also includes the option for an eligible voter to provide a physical description of where they maintain their residence if they live in an area that does not have 911 or street addresses. The amendment also strengthens the language access provisions passed in 2023 that provide translated materials to voters on Election Day. The amendment includes a provision to allow voters to use the online absentee ballot request tool in all elections except for March Townships, not just state elections. And finally, the bill includes provisions to ensure voter registration data is protected and only used for the purposes authorized in statute. It clarifies who can serve as an exit pollster, and it makes changes to the post-election timeline to bring Minnesota into compliance with the Federal Electoral Count Reform Act. I want to again thank the chair and the committee for their work on this amendment and over the course of this session, and I'm available for questions as the committee continues to discuss this amendment. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Next up, we have Jay Myung. And please, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, please be sure to state your name for the record and then go ahead and provide your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Wesley and members of the Senate Election Committee. My name is Jae Myung. I'm Policy and Advocacy Associate at Coalition of Asian American Leaders, also known as CAL. CAL advocates for the empowerment of all members of our communities and Minnesotans as a whole, amplifying the voices of those most impacted and fostering unity, relationship building, and solidarity. Today, I am here to speak in support of Senate File 4729, and especially to shed light on the importance of voter language access for our communities. Last session, this committee passed critical provisions toward increased language access at the polls that were very important to our Asian community members. And we are grateful and excited for their enactment this year. As helpful as these resources are, we need our voters to be aware of them in order to make a real impact. Senate File 4729 has counties publicly post the polling locations that are going to have on-site interpreter in advance, also which languages they will be translating. This would lead our community members to be confident to show up to the poll. As you are all familiar, the literal translation of written materials often lead to even greater difficulties in understanding. The first generation voters and non-English speakers in our community has expressed these difficulties continuously, and this lead to hesitancy among them to exercise their voting rights. On the other hand, an on-site interpreter would be better equipped to translate critical information in a simple and effective manner, encouraging voter participation and offering crucial support to community in exercising their fundamental right to vote. This would also create a safe and welcoming space for first-time non-English speaking voters or those feeling intimidated by the polls. I urge the committee to consider the profound impact of voting language access on the that every voice is heard in our elections. Thank you to Senator Carlson, Senator Westlin, and Senator Bolden for your leadership on this provision and for its inclusion in Senate File 4729. I would respectfully ask for committee members' support of this important legislation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you so much. And also, members, there is a letter from CAAL in your packets. Thank you so much for your testimony today. We have one final testifier via Zoom, Lily Sassy from We Choose Us. Go ahead and say your name for the record and proceed.
Great. Thank you so much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I am Lily Sassy, the director of We Choose Us, and it is a pleasure to be testifying in front of this committee again. We Choose Us is a coalition of over 40 grassroots organizations, unions, and advocacy groups committed to building a multiracial democracy in Minnesota. You have a letter in your packets detailing who those organizations are if you are interested. We are so excited about this year's Senate Elections Policy Omnibus Bill, which includes many key provisions that will protect, strengthen, and expand our state's democracy. More specifically, the elimination of prison gerrymandering in our state, which counts incarcerated individuals at their place of legal residency rather than their prison location for redistricting purposes. This would ensure fair and accurate representation for all communities and would especially work against the dilution of political power in communities of color. Pre-registration provisions in school districts, a bill that provides voter registration and pre-registration applications to high school students, ensuring students are aware of their registration options and bringing them essential information to better understand electoral participation, and efforts to build on and strengthen our state's recently passed language access at the polls provisions, including expanded translation and interpretation. Our coalition continues to appreciate steps towards a democracy that works for all Minnesotans. In addition to these critical initiatives, We Choose Us also supports several additional proposals that are essential to strengthening Minnesota's democracy, including on-campus polling locations at post-secondary institutions that would provide greater ability for college students to vote, reducing key voting barriers many youth face, and ensuring that young Minnesotans' voices are heard in our elections. And the Minnesota Voting Rights Act would restore and clarify protections against discrimination for voters of color in Minnesota, as well as the local public financing legislation that would grant local jurisdictions the authority to create local public financing programs if they choose to do so. We really thank members of the Senate Elections Committee for supporting these bills. I know you've heard them so far this session, and ask for your continued stewardship of these important proposals. Thank you all for this session's pro-democracy package, especially Chair Carlson, and we ask that members of the Senate Elections Committee support these essential provisions that this legislation contains. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for your testimony today. And members, there is also an additional letter of support from We Choose Us, but also from the Minnesota School Boards Association. So at this time, we have concluded our business for today. As I mentioned earlier, today was the day we were going to be doing the walkthrough. Our intention is to consider amendments and have a further discussion of the bill on Thursday, at which time we will be voting on the Omnibus Elections Policy Bill. I thank you all for being here today. Thank you to our testifiers. And with that, we are adjourned.
We're in an efficient meeting now, Chair.